Good evening and welcome to the Silicon Valley Entrepreneur, a series of conversations with startup founders and the investors who work with them to help turn their companies into viable, fundable businesses. I'm Chris Gill, President and CEO of SVAs, the Silicon Valley Association of Startup Entrepreneurs, the largest and fastest growing not-for-profit for entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley. And this week I'll be interviewing Paul Holland, the general partner who coordinates clean technology for his venture firm, Foundation Capital. Paul, good to see you. Thank you for coming along.
Thank you, Chris.
Welcome to the Silicon Valley Entrepreneur. First, can I ask, I know you started out at the SRI Institute, Stanford Research Institute. So how did you go from there to venture capital and then clean tech?
Right. Well, it's a circuitous story, but I'll do it as quickly as I can. I started at Stanford Research Institute, SRI International, in 1984. And while I was there, I was doing research on a variety of topics. That's what it was. It was a think tank. And as time went by, more and more of our clients were interested in more technology-related information, advanced technologies, things like advanced structural ceramics, ultra-large-scale integrated circuits, optical storage. So I became the person responsible for monitoring some of those technologies as I moved up in my career at SRI. I then got an opportunity to go to a smaller boutique firm that was focused in one of those areas while I was getting my MBA at night at Berkeley. And when I was finishing my MBA, I got a phone call from a friend of mine, my best friend from SRI, and he connected me up with this young entrepreneur who was my age, a guy named Reed Hastings. And so we talked, and Reed said, I've invented this new form of software called Purify. Do you want to come and help me take this product to market? And I joined him in full-time in 1992. We took that company public in 1995 as Pure Software. Became worth about $1 billion after a while. Did that. During the course of that time, moved over to Europe, ran Europe for them for a couple of years, which was very fun. And then finished that gig, went and did a sabbatical, traveled the world with my wife. We've been to 50 countries together, so we had a nice time. Grew my hair out, got the ponytail, the whole thing. Came back to the venture capitalist who funded Pure Software, Andy Ratcliffe from now Benchmark Capital, and said, what do you have for me to do next? And he said, I got this thing called Kana. You should go check it out. And I became the head of worldwide sales for a company called Kana Communications. 18 months later, we took that company public. It was worth $9 billion for about 15 minutes during the boom, which was very exciting. And when I was finished with that, I got a call from a friend of mine at Foundation Capital and said, we're thinking of adding a partner in your area of discipline. Do you want to come and join us? So I ended up moving over there in 2001.
Wow, that sounds awfully simple and straightforward. I'm sure it wasn't as simple. But
yeah, it wasn't. I had a lot of sleepless nights along the way, but it ended up with some good outcomes. So.
Okay, so how did you go from there to now being the lead on the clean tech practice?
Yeah. Well, clean tech, I handle it from a bunch of different angles, basically. I'd give it from one, describe the first element of it is really around luck. Back in February of 2002, a friend of mine from Kana, who had been a professor at Stanford, had moved to Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire, to run the entrepreneurship program for the business school there. So he called me and said, Paul, would you come and do a one-day kind of teaching gig? And I'd done these before at Harvard and Stanford, just one day on how to start companies and grow revenue and so forth. So after an arduous trip to Hanover, New Hampshire, which I thought was just a suburb, like we're just outside of Boston, I didn't realize it was a long, long way, and I drove through a snowstorm. I got there and taught my class, did the office hours, had dinner with some students, and in each one of those increments, two students joined. A fellow named Tim Healy was the key guy, and then his partner David Brewster. And they had come up with this idea, now this is going back again to 2002, that they called demand response. And to be honest with you, I didn't quite get it when they first explained it to me, and I'll tell you what happened to the thing later. But they said, well, we've done this project, it's our class project, and we won the business plan competition for demand response. And I said, well, how does that work? And they said, we're using Southern Connecticut as our proving ground. So we went around to all the large users of energy in Southern Connecticut, the Safeway stores, the community colleges, and so forth. And we said, Chris, you run operations for Safeway Southern Connecticut. You've got 150 stores. Let me sign a contract with you where maybe up to 4 hours at a time, 4 or 5 times a year, I'm going to take you off the grid. I'm going to kick on your backup power generation. I'm going to dim the lights in your store. I'm going to raise the temperature in your freezer. But again, for only 4 or 5 hours at a time, and I'm only going to do that a handful of times a year. To which you'd reply, and I'll pay you $150,000 for that, by the way. To which you replied, where do I sign? Because you were doing all that work anyway as part of your backup strategy, as part of your job. So these young guys went and they signed up Safeway, they signed up these various different places. Then they went to the head of local utility and they said, Joe, you run Southern Connecticut Utilities. I've got 20 megawatts of power. I can deliver it within a half an hour's notice. And it's from your existing customer base that's a very reliable source. And I can deliver that to you at any time. And is that interesting? And Joe, who had been testifying before Congress because of brownouts in his facility, said, yes, that's very interesting, and I'll pay you $90,000 a megawatt per year for that capability. So that was February 2002. Later, after a bunch of twists and turns, my partner Adam Grosser ended up making an investment in this company now called Enernoc. Enernoc went public and was worth $1 billion last year after its IPO. The company will do somewhere north of $100 million in sales this year. I believe those are their public numbers. So it's a very exciting company, and that was my first introduction to cleantech at that level. Okay.
Now, from being a niche area only a few years ago, most VC firms now have a cleantech practice, and investments in cleantech, according to PricewaterhouseCoopers, look set to exceed software in the not too distant future. We had the software bubble in 2000. Is this another bubble in the making?
I think yes and no. There are certainly areas of cleantech that are very, very heavily invested, and at Foundation Capital we've done our level best to stay away from those, but I'm sure we won't be unscathed at some level. Very broadly speaking, the way we've thought about this is this notion of the difference between supply side and demand side. So on the supply side, you have the fairly traditional things you'd think about: ethanol, biodiesel, solar, and so forth. We've done a little bit of work there, but the vast majority of the work that we've done is on the demand side. And the demand side for us are things like smart grid, green materials, energy efficiency, those type of things. We think saving a watt is a lot easier and a lot more cost effective than creating a new one. And we've made most of our investments on that thesis, and knock wood, it's worked out quite well for us.
Okay, so, but at the end of it, is there a bubble, or is this going to have legs and continue to be an evolving area for the next several years?
I think that what you'll see, like you saw in the internet time period, is a rolling series of bubbles that will happen in different categories. I think if you go back 18 months ago, there was a bubble that developed around ethanol. Absolutely. There was the notion that everybody had to have an ethanol investment, and so you looked at many, many companies and they had ethanol investments. That bubble has largely burst. We saw some failures, we saw some companies unable to go public and so forth. We're perhaps in the midst of a solar bubble now. It's a little bit hard to tell. That one's hard to read because there's tremendous demand. If we look forward into the coming decades, solar is going to be a bigger and bigger part of the energy equation, so it's hard to bet against it at some level, and yet within specific cases, there are probably times when it's overvalued. We haven't yet seen a bubble in the areas that we've concentrated on. The smart grid, energy efficiency, demand response, those are areas in which we still see very robust demand. Now, on the public markets, all of those stocks, and most all of those stocks, have seen some pretty significant deflation. But that's a little bit of the sign of the times. Okay, so
I'll definitely come back to that. But it's something that came up when I was up at Stanford recently. What are the differences in demand for energy between industrialized nations and those without power distribution networks? Because there are different opportunities in those countries. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Sure. So if you think about, very broadly speaking, the two worlds, the world of the grid, where the grid is well established and in place and so forth, and the world in which the grid is not well established. It's either spotty, it's unreliable, in some places it just fundamentally doesn't exist. So in the world, let's call it the advanced world for the lack of a better way to describe it, where the grid is well established, we've had rural electrification for close to 100 years in some cases a little more, in some cases a little less. In the U.S., such a large landmass, it took until the 30s and 40s to really get to where you had ubiquitous electrical power capability for residences all across the board. If we look at where we are now in the advanced world from a utility perspective, we're about to see a very major changeover, really the most significant one in the last 100 years. And that's the difference between analog technology and digital technology. So at the level of the meter itself, where you and I grew up with this notion of the thing that spun round and round, there was always a gentleman that would drive his truck up and mark down how much was used, that's about to go away in its entirety. Companies like Procter & Gamble, like Pacific Gas and Electric, Procter & Gamble in a different way, but PG&E, companies like Southern California Edison, companies like Florida Power and Light, have already made large-scale commitments and large-scale public pronouncements. PG&E, as an example, is committed they're going to convert their entire meter infrastructure to digital meters by the year 2012. That's a massive changeover and a huge opportunity of the neighborhood of $1 trillion opportunity just in that segment alone.
So, okay, but what happens to the requirement for clean technology in a country with a distributed power capability and one without it,
right,
such as India or China?
yes.
So what are the differences that you're seeing in opportunities in those two types of countries?
So I think in the first case, in the places where the infrastructure is already in place, we're seeing huge opportunities to upgrade and modernize that infrastructure. It's almost medieval. It's the technology is so faulty and so inefficient at some level. Some of the grid has really not been updated for decades, and it's ripe for that now, both from a regulatory environment, from the cost of energy, from the moral imperative around global warming, from government regulation. It's all going in one direction, and that's to really modernize the grid in the developed world. In the less developed world, I think what we're seeing are more distributed sources of power that are being generated. You see small, 100 kilowatt plants, you see half a megawatt plants, you see things like that are being done. Small scale hydropower to take advantage of places where there are villages where there might be running water but no other logical source of power. We're seeing interesting variants of this now. We're seeing solar powered water purification systems that are going in to some of the really rural environments. In China already leads the world in solar thermal technology, as you probably know if you go around to most of rural China. Virtually every house has a solar hot water heater on the roof with solar thermal panels to heat the water. So we're already seeing a lot of that happen. It's not yet grid connected and certainly not digital and a full-scale network along the lines of what's happening in the West. But over time, all of that has to move in that direction.
Okay. So just to go back on that, you said earlier that you're tending to focus on opportunities as far as your investments are concerned, where you can save energy rather than do new energy. So, so are most of your investments happening in North America, in the industrialized area? And can you give some examples?
So yes, most of our investments are in North America, but nearly every one of our companies will have a global reach. It either has it today or it will have a global reach. So I'll give you a handful of examples in different categories. Okay. One is, broadly speaking, the smart grid. So we have 3 companies that are very active in the smart grid. Enernoc, the one that I mentioned before, that does demand response technologies, which now has contracts all across North America, has contracts in Australia, has contracts in Europe. So it's becoming a global company very quickly. To give you a sense of the scale, when we think about the energy that can be saved by kind of repurposing energy the way that Enernoc does with its demand response system, they've occupied somewhere in the neighborhood of a couple of gigawatts of power. We think that the world capacity for that is north of 760 gigawatts of power.
Wow, okay.
So there's a massive, massive market out there that will be populated over time by these demand response companies in some form or another. Another area that we focused on around smart grid is, as I mentioned, the digital metering technology.
Yes.
So we have a company called Silver Spring Networks that makes the operating system and networking software for the last mile of metering, which has always been the really hardest point to crack. Many, many companies have attacked this and no one has succeeded yet. Silver Spring is in a position that is tremendously wonderful for them from an opportunity perspective. They've sold both Pacific Gas and Electric and Florida Power and Light, the 2 largest contracts to date. And this is a company that will have literally hundreds of millions of revenue in their backlog, and with tremendous opportunity ahead of them internationally. And then finally, within that category, we have a company called eMeter. And what eMeter does is very simple. They make the middleware solution that connects up all these smart meters. So when the utility wants to do something like differentiated pricing around certain times of day or certain types of usage, eMeter creates the software that allows them to do that, to measure it, to analyze it, and to make it actionable. So that's in that one category in smart grid. Those are a few examples. Okay.
So you mentioned it a little bit earlier. There's obviously considerable pressure to move away from fossil fuels, certainly in the industrialized world. But some of the previous darlings of clean tech, like the biofuels, like hydrogen fuel cells, seem to become tarnished of late. What's the current status and trends in these areas?
Right. So I think if you look at the area of the supply side, which is what you're referring to now, there have been a number of false starts, and I think I don't question anybody's passion around it. I question the timing, and quite frankly, I question the appropriateness of venture capital as a model for some of these things, because really these are large-scale, almost governmental-level initiatives that are required to get a hydrogen infrastructure in place, to get a biofuels infrastructure in place. And yet there are some very intriguing investments people have made in that arena. I think the places on the supply side that seem to me, at least personally, more intriguing are around solar, are around what are called PPAs, or power purchase agreements. There's a company called Sunrun that we recently invested in out of San Francisco, and they're the leading provider of residential PPAs, or power purchase agreements. Here's an easy way to think about that. You've got a home and you want to put 8 kilowatts of power on your home. You could call up and spend $30,000, $40,000 to do that, or you can call Sunrun. They'll bring all the people in, they'll do the installation for you, they'll charge you a fraction of that, and then they share the proceeds over a period of years. They essentially create the equivalent of a private utility. That type of thing is growing very, very rapidly now on the supply side. We're intrigued by that. We're intrigued by solar. Still tremendous amount of opportunity there. We're intrigued by geothermal. We're intrigued by nuclear. I mean, those are all things that are very, very interesting. The demand for new sources of energy is unfathomable. I mean, it's almost limitless. And so someone is going to be a big winner in that space, but we've already identified who some of the losers are already, and that's difficult.
Okay. So, and are biofuels and hydrogen fuel cells losers in your mind for the foreseeable future?
I wouldn't say for the foreseeable future. I'd say largely for the past up until today, it's been a very, very challenging area for investment, in part because everybody got out ahead of themselves. They said, well, if we go build this, if we build the refineries, build the factories, then we'll be able to get it out into the distribution network. In some cases that succeeded, in many other cases it hasn't. There's been some notable failures there. I think the other thing that was unanticipated when you come to things like ethanol, certainly corn-based ethanol, is nobody really quite anticipated what was going to happen with the food markets and the explosive prices that have occurred in food. So now you're in a situation where you're having to make a trade-off between, do I use corn for food or do I use it to create energy? And that's just not a great place to be when there are so many other alternatives available.
Right. And that's a good lead into the another question that's been batted around along. Again, recently when I was at the same meeting up at Stanford, some leaders in the energy field up there believe that, at least in the medium term, nuclear energy is a much better bet than almost any other potential energy source, particularly in industrialized countries where you have the distribution network. What's your view on that? You mentioned nuclear. What's your view on that?
Well, I think nuclear is a complicated arena. One, the waste issues haven't been solved completely, and so that's still going to stand in the way of large-scale adoption within established areas within the advanced world, because frankly, it's the not in my backyard, the NIMBY complex is going to kick in.
Sure.
And so people are very concerned about that aspect. They're concerned about safety and so forth. However, in places such as France that have made large-scale infrastructure investments there, and France generates somewhere in the neighborhood of 70% of its power from nuclear sources, they're proving to be very prescient and have really seen over the horizon what the right move to make was. In the United States, we had a very abortive attempt to do broad-scale nuclear. We had 3 Mile Island. We had other issues that came into place that caused us to step back. Again, looking at the magnitude of the need, nuclear is going to be part of the solution in some form or another. I think one of the biggest challenges with nuclear is the lead time associated with it. If you and I agreed today we're going to go fund a nuclear power plant, we're 10 to 15 years before we turn it on. So that's a long way down the road, and I think a lot of things will have to happen as intermediate steps between now and then. Okay.
So switching gears on this quite a way, California is rightly famous for its wind farms. There's also experiments with ocean wave generators, and these get a lot of press for the innovation. But they seem to be struggling to reach viable critical mass. Are these just interesting projects for a small group of enthusiasts, or can they really be major contributors to the grid?
I think when you look at wind, there's no question that wind is going to be a big factor. It depends on where you are. If you're in the Altamont Pass, you get a lot of wind all the time, so that's great. Where I live in Portola Valley, we don't get so much wind, so it's not a great local generator for us. If you're on the Texas coast, there's a tremendous amount of wind. If you're, as you know, if you're in the North Sea, anywhere around the North Sea, you have a tremendous amount of wind. And those are places where I think you can see large-scale wind generation become a significant part of the solution. But it's not for everywhere, and it's not for every situation. I think when you look at that versus, say, ocean wave power, the notion of the equivalent of hydroelectric power, but done by the movement of ocean waves, very, very compelling, very promising, but extremely early days. So that's a place where huge risk-reward kind of ratio for people that are in the venture community. If somebody gets it right, they'll have a big win, a la some of the big winners in solar. A lot of people are going to get it wrong, and they're going to spend a lot of money on prototypes that ultimately won't be successful.
Okay. So I think I'm hearing that's currently for the enthusiasts at the moment, but maybe not for the serious investor. So one thing the wind farms and the wave generators have got going for them is they can operate in the dark. And will solar cell systems continue to be limited, particularly in the developed world, until better batteries or better ways of energy storage can be developed?
Well, so I think certainly batteries and storage technologies are an extremely attractive area for investment right now. We've looked at a number of those technologies. Most of our brethren who are doing clean tech investing have looked very closely. Not too many investments made yet around that because there's still significant challenges, but tremendous area of opportunity to be able to take solar power generated in the day, store it at night, and reuse it. I will say, however, I think the solution is actually much closer at hand than people realize, and that's in the form of automobiles. As we go forward over time, what we're going to begin to see is something that is going to be completely revolutionary and almost entirely positive for humankind, as it were. If you look at California with the rules around AB 32, which is something that most of the people in the clean tech world are quite familiar with, by the year 2020 in California, if you're going to build a new residence, that residence has to be energy independent. It has to create enough of its own energy to be able to run its own energy source, basically, and that's largely going to be solar. But it can be other sources, too. If you're in a wind area, that could be wind. By 2030, commercial buildings are going to be required to be energy independent. And that's a complete sea change from where we are today. When that begins to happen, you're going to see some really interesting phenomena occur, and I'm pumping this a little bit because I'm headed down that path in my personal life with what we're doing with our home. But you're going to find people are going to essentially create the equivalent of energy factories with their homes and with their businesses, and they're going to use those to power their cars and power other parts of their life that are currently run by fossil fuels today. In short, you're going to see people put enough solar power on their roofs or on the skins of buildings that can power cars during the day, and then they can be used as backup power generation and batteries at night.
Let's talk a little bit about that, because you are doing something on that, and it's not actually that far away. It's only 12 years down the road now.
That's right.
In the building industry, which is renowned for being slow in adopting new technologies. But this is being mandated. Now, you're ahead of the game. We talked about this a little bit earlier. You're doing this with your home. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, there's a few different angles to this. First, let me answer the part about just the building industry itself.
Okay.
There is a whole new generation of companies coming out today. We have funded a couple of them ourselves. One is called CalStar and the other is called Sirius Materials. They're recreating the building industry product by product. They're creating new forms of products. Sirius Materials is a great example. They have a product called EcoRock. It'll replace drywall as we know it today. Drywall today is a very energy-intensive product. It's a very intensive product from a carbon off-gassing perspective for a variety of reasons in the way it's made. This new product, EcoRock, is going to have very, very low carbon off-gassing and extremely low amount of energy used in its production. So it's going to be a complete sea change from what we're seeing today. You can take that and apply it to windows, which is what Sirius is doing. You can take it and apply it to cement and bricks, which is what CalStar is doing. And you just simply go down the line, and all the traditional building material products will be reinvented over the next 5 or 10 years in more green formats. And that's an area that's very interesting to us. Lower embodied energy, lower carbon off-gassing are great outcomes. But let's speak about the house a little bit. So we began the process of designing a new home because we live in a very old home that's kind of falling down. So we began this process about 4.5 years ago. About halfway through the design process, we got introduced to a woman named Ann Edminster. And Ann is one of the co-authors of the LEED for Home standard in California. LEED is Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. It's a point system, and you get a certain number of points, and you're either certified or you're silver or you're gold or you're platinum. So my wife and I are both type A personalities, got interested in the whole point thing, wanted to get all the points. And so we started designing our house with that goal in mind and really with the notion of how green could we make this custom home. And long story short, we now have on paper the greenest home in the system. It'll be north of 20 points more green than the highest standard. 89 points get you to platinum, and we're pushing about 120 points with this house. So
this is an example of the type of thing that the average buyer could be looking at in 20 years' time. And what type of, not even 12 years' time,
That's right.
Type of thing what type of systems are you putting in there?
Sure. So there are a whole different things, and I'll try to boil it down into the essence of it. There are a handful of categories that are important when you're thinking about this type of thing. Energy, waste, water, materials, and habitat. Those are the 5 areas that we focused on the most.
Okay.
So I'll start with habitat. We've taken down all of our fences, and we've taken all the non-native fauna off of our property, flora rather, off of our property. The fauna come and go
flora come and go as they wish.
Right, so we've taken all the non-native trees and bushes and so
right.
forth, and we've taken them out. We've taken over 50 trees off of our property because they're birches and beeches and maples and things like that that just don't belong in California. They soak up too much water, they attract the wrong kind of pests and so forth. We've taken all those out, and we're repopulating the land with native trees here, horse chestnuts, live oaks, and so forth. And that'll have a positive impact on the land. From a materials perspective, we have only 4 materials that we're working with the house. We're doing wood, steel, glass, and stone. So those are 4 materials. We have no composite materials. We have no petroleum-based materials going into the house. From a waste perspective, we're recycling all of the water that comes into the home in whatever form it goes out. And it goes through 2 forms of filtration. One is a regular septic tank, and the other is what's called a submerged wetland, which essentially filters the water to where in theory, it's potable at the end of that process. We're never going to test it because it just stays underground and goes out and is distributed subterranean into an irrigation field. So that's another area that we're doing some work around water and waste management. And finally, in energy, we're very aggressive with this. We're putting 23 kilowatts of solar power on the roof of the house. And that power is more than enough to make us energy independent. In fact, net energy positive. We'll create more energy than we use over the course of the year. But we have 3 children who are young today, but they'll be older at some point, we hope. And we intend to convert our cars to electric cars, and over time we think that that's what they're likely to drive. So our notion as a family is that within 2 years we want to be completely off of fossil fuels. We want to completely out of our lives. We want to stop going to gas stations.
Well, this is really quite something that not only are you living it through the work you do and the investments you do, but you're really living it on a personal level. This is quite something. Unfortunately, while there's several more things I'd like to ask you about, we have run out of time.
Sure. Okay.
So thank you again, Paul, for coming along.
Not at all. Thank you.
And good night from the Silicon Valley Entrepreneur. This is Chris Gill with Silicon Valley Association of Startup Entrepreneurs signing off for this evening. Thank you.